Hello and welcome to this webinar from King's Business School. I'd just like to welcome you all here today for our inaugural webinar. We will be talking predominantly about guiding organisations through turbulent times, and in a moment I will hand over to two of our faculty, Dr. Renuka Fernando, Director of Strategy here at King's College, and Professor Crawford Spence, Professor of Accounting and Vice Dean. A few little bits of housekeeping before we really get going, just to let you know that this webinar will be recorded in full, so any questions that are asked, any things like that, and everything that's said will be recorded, and we will circulate a copy afterwards so that you can check back through anything that you want to look more into and anything like that. Really, what we want to do today is give you an idea about what we offer here at King's Business School through our executive education programmes. We have a growing portfolio of programmes which I will talk a little bit about later after the main discussion, and what we would do normally if everyone was in a room together, or if it was a full program, is really it's about facilitating a conversation and drawing on the experience of everyone in the room, rather than having sort of the sage on the stage and having you just listen and learn, so to speak. So please do, through the Q&A function on Microsoft Teams, please do add your own experiences and ask questions. In terms of questions, we will be muting the microphones just for the best experience all round, and taking questions towards the end, but please do put questions through as you think of them, and we will definitely pull those out at the end and work through them. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Crawford Spence.
Yeah, so I'm Crawford Spence. I'm in charge of Exec Ed here in the Business School at King's College London. I'm also a Professor of Accounting for my sins, and I'm going to talk today for about 10 or 15 minutes about financial resilience in challenging times, namely in the context of the current pandemic that we are facing. And then I'll hand over to Renuka, who'll talk about things more from a people perspective. And then once we've both spoken for 10 to 15 minutes, we'll try and come back and have a more interactive discussion with some of the questions and chats that are emerging on the chat and Q&A functions. And as Sarah pointed out, we're not pretending here we have all the answers to any of the problems that organisations are facing, and indeed that's not really the way we approach things in terms of an executive education ethos at King's. We try and stimulate conversations among people and provide a context within which they can learn partly from ourselves, but also primarily from each other. So, it'd be interesting to hear other people's experiences and what their organisations are going through at this moment as well. So please do use the chat function as much as you can. Okay, I'm going to try and move on to the next slide here. So just a few things here just to provide some context before we talk about specific things that organisations might want to engage in order to improve their financial resilience in the current period. This is just some data from the Office of National Statistics in the UK, and it's looking more at the household level. And what you're looking at here are three different scenarios, from a more conservative scenario through to more extreme scenarios, where they're looking at proportion of households who have sufficient financial assets to cover a 3-month reduction in household employment income. So just 3-month reduction, not a full year or anything like that. And income reduction of 25%, 50% or 75%. And you can see the progressive impact that these different scenarios would have on the financial resilience of households. Interestingly, also we have self-employed individuals tend to be more financially resilient than employees. Many self-employed people run businesses, and it's probably related to that. But you can see that even with a modest reduction in income, lots of people immediately fall below a certain threshold. Yeah? So for 3 months, if your income drops by 25%, less than 80% of people have formal financial assets to cover that. And that gets much worse as you move into more extreme scenarios as well. And the parallel there with organisations is quite strong as well, and we'll see some of the data that relates to organisations as we move forward with this. So this is just a synopsis of an interesting study that came out just a few weeks ago in an academic journal, the details of which are down there for those who are interested. And this was a really massive study that a couple of academics from Spain undertook, looking at 14,000 firms across 26 countries. I don't think it was just Europe, I think it extended to other continents as well. And they were looking at the impact of what a 50 to 75% sales drop would have upon the liquidity of different organizations. And they looked specifically at 3 different financial ratios. Okay, so one is what we call the cash burn rate. So that's the speed at which you run through your cash reserves. And the second and third ratios are really, more standard liquidity ratios, comparing cash income or cash flow from operations to different forms of different debt metrics, whether it's current liabilities, the obligations that you have to pay in the short term, or total debt. So that's a combination of short term and long term obligations as well. And again, this is a sort of scenario planning perspective here, looking at different numbers, different scenarios. And they're saying here that if sales drop by 50% for a firm, and that drop sustained itself over the longer term, then the average firm would exhaust its cash holdings within 3 years. If sales drop by 75%, the average firm would exhaust its cash holdings within 2 years. And a couple of things to notice about that. One is that obviously the more your sales drop, the bigger strain is placed upon your cash reserves. No surprise there. But the second thing for me is it's almost quite surprising that so many firms have that level of resilience and have that level of cash to sustain such significant drops in their revenues. Half to 3/4, they can still survive for 2 to 3 years with cash. That suggests that actually the majority of firms are not sailing close to the edge in terms of having weak balance sheets. Actually, a lot of balance sheets are quite strong. That being said, even in the conservative range here, sales drop by 50%, 10% of firms would become illiquid within 6 months. So there are still significant numbers of organizations that don't have that strong, significant cash buffer to see them through difficult times. And the solution to that is really for all of these organizations, it's not just to wait until sales pick up. Even if you're in the stronger sort of bracket there, you need to find more cash from somewhere. Cash is really king in this current context. And where do you get cash from if it's not from sales or general operations? Well, it's going to be either equity markets or debt markets. And there are problems with both of those issues, which I'll try to talk about presently. So, just to further reinforce the point that cash is super important here, this is just a story from the FT earlier this month. Ted Baker, famous high street retail fashion retailer, was going back to the financial markets to try and find $95 million in order to survive the current crisis. And their prognosis was that without this extra cash, the firm would be insolvent by August. Although their online sales have been up since lockdown, which is the case with almost any organization that has an online capability, overall they're still selling less than they were prior to the crisis. So like for like sales, which is the more sort of acid test metric, if you like, shows that they were down 34% overall for the last few months. So they were not getting the money coming in that they had anticipated coming in. So their solution here was to go to equity markets, and trying to cut their debt and get new injection of equity. So, from investors, essentially. Why would they go for equity? Well, the specifics of this organization suggest that they couldn't take on any more debt because they had debt covenants. So these are stipulations that are put in by bondholders or banks or anyone who lends money to organizations that say things like, well, if you go over a certain leverage ratio or a certain proportion of debt to equity, then we can just recall our bonds, recall our debt instruments, or we can charge you punitive penalty payments as a result of that. So debt, although a lot of organizations are looking to debt just now, many organizations cannot because they're already up at the limit of their debt covenants, which is why you see a lot of organizations turn into equity markets. Okay, people who are investing in stocks and shares rather than things like bonds or debt instruments to try and get that injection of cash that will help them pay off their short-term and medium-term liabilities. And you can see equity placings in UK markets that, you know, in May this year, they significantly went up. I don't have current figures for June. We'll get them towards the end of the month. But there has been significant movement in equity markets in the current period, trying to resolve these cash flow problems that organizations are suffering. And, you know, financial regulators have made this easier as well. So they've done things like, you know, normally you would have to go to existing investors first to offer them the opportunity to buy additional shares, because obviously existing investors, they have a reluctance for more shares to be issued because that dilutes the current share price and dilutes their investment. So they normally get first dibs, if you like, on any new share issue. Regulations like that have been relaxed in the current period just in order to make it easier for companies to go to the equity markets and get money from wherever it's available. Now, what that has meant in reality is that organizations have been going to big institutional investors to try and find sources of funds, and arguably that's to the detriment of retail investors as well, who have not as organised and not as well connected in terms of hearing about when different issues are going to take place. So, you know, there are issues to do with that, but equally we see that not everyone is trying to get cash from equity markets just in order to pay off debt or to fund their operations. Those that are in potentially stronger positions, and they don't look like they're necessarily going to go to the wall in the short term, are trying to get extra injections of cash from the markets so that they can build up a war chest with which to go post-crisis or whenever other organizations start to struggle, and maybe go on a buying spree, a mergers and acquisitions spree, or find other ways of investing in operations or new strategies, new areas in order to take more market share from competitors. So, you know, it's not just about solving distressed, solving financial distress problems. It's also about thinking more strategically and proactively for those who are in a position to do so. But, you know, there's also evidence to suggest that equity markets are only going to be so useful to organizations in the current climate. Yeah, so this is a story from, again, earlier in this month in the FT, and this is Anne Richards, a picture of Anne Richards, who's chief executive at Fidelity, one of the world's biggest asset managers, and she's talking specifically about the extent to which equity markets can come to the rescue of organizations. And she was casting aspersions or doubt upon their ability to do so. So, you know, many organisations currently are looking at being propped up by government loans, especially in the UK, and, you know, to greater or lesser extent in other countries as well. These government loans will either be written off at one point or paid back, or they will just sit on balance sheets where they will continue to have a depressing effect for organisations. This means that organisations are going to need to be recapitalised to some extent in the short to medium term. However, you know, the view of Anne Richards is that fund managers don't have enough resources to recapitalise all struggling companies, and not all struggling companies are worth investing in from a sort of investment perspective either. Indeed, if you look at the cash that fund managers are holding just now, you know, historically looking across the UK, they tend to hold between 4.5% to 5% of their assets will be in cash. Currently, they've increased that to more like 5.5% to 6% due to their own liquidity fears and the need to be more flexible and agile in terms of putting resources into different areas. So that means there's less money available. There's only 1 percentage point, but if you think about the size of the global asset management industry is maybe $30 trillion or something, that's still a significant amount of money that is not then going to be available to be investing in companies. So as a result of these things, you know, the limited amount of money that asset managers have in the first place, and the greater restrictions that they're putting on their investments, that means that many companies are not going to be bailed out. Well, A, by the government in the long term, which is never the plan anyway. The governments are only offering short-term rescue packages, but B, by equity markets either, which means inevitably some companies will go to the wall, and others will be looking at major restructurings or acquisitions by stronger competitors. But of course, it's important to recognise that not everyone is suffering in the current market. You know, I mean, here's just a few pieces of information from 3 different organisations. You know, so one over here on the left is from Nissan, which is not Nissan the car maker, but Nissan the food producer in Japan. And this is a chart showing their sales of instant noodles over the past 12 months, pretty much. And you can see since, you know, the coronavirus lockdown came in, sort of March, April, you know, they've been selling more noodles than any time in the previous 12 months. So, you know, Japanese people hoard instant noodles, British people hoard toilet paper. I suppose as an equivalent for every country, which reflects something about that nation's collective anxieties. Over here we have Delivery Hero, which is a sort of Deliveroo type company based, I think, mostly in Germany. Actually, I think that, you know, it started in Berlin. And you know, online deliveries, or you know these sort of deliveries of fast food have as another sector which has rocketed, where those activities are allowed to take place. And certainly in Germany, they've been allowed to take place over the last few months. So if you just look at the share price of Delivery Hero up there, you know, it's way down at 30 euros per share about 12 months ago, 18 months ago. It's now up at 90 as well. And the significant part of that growth has been in the last few months. You know, so look at the lockdown period onwards. It's really, you know, it's really boosted from just above 50 right the way up to 90. Yeah, and down here, this is another organisation called Market Access, which is I think it's a debt exchange. And the point here is not to show how much people are turning to debt or equity, rather to show that there's been significant activity in financial markets, and there are companies out there that service that and organise that activity, Market Access being one of them, in terms of the exchange and issue of debt. Do a lot of back office work and brokerage functions, I believe, or at least working with brokers. And you can see that the volume of credit traded on their exchanges in recent times has also almost doubled. Yeah, so there's been, you know, there are a lot of losers in the current crisis, but there have been some winners as well, which is important it's important to remember that. Okay, so last couple of slides now. This I think is a useful one, which you know, I found from KPMG's website of all places, and this is very sort of UK centric. So from those of you who are logging in from around the world, you'll have to excuse some of the acronyms, which are, you know, very idiosyncratic and specific to the British context. So what we have here, just to explain this, is a range of different options. You know, we've got 22 different things that organisations can engage in to improve their liquidity in the current crisis. Okay, and they're sort of grouped into different colours. So those that are purple are operational things you can do, actually changing your operations as an organisation. Those in the light blue are financial, so things that, you know, your accountants would implement. And then there are government-related ones in this sort of turquoise green colour. And the size of the bubbles here are reflective of those which can add the most value to your organisation. So the first one here, for example, number 17, the biggest one on the chart, is this job retention scheme that the government implemented, where you can furlough staff, i.e. take them off of your operational activity, and have the government pay their wages to a limit of 80% of their wages, up to £2,500 per month or something. So huge numbers of organisations have taken advantage of that. Our own organisation, King's College, has taken advantage of that in many areas, and there are millions of people now whose wages are effectively being paid for by the government. So, you know, that's an obvious thing that pretty much everybody knows about. Other big things here to look at. Number 2 is mothballing some or all operations, or literally just stopping certain activities. And I'm sure a lot of you who've worked in organisations have witnessed some of that. That's a short-term thing, you know. So again, this chart can be carved up into different areas. There's short-term impact, which is helpful, but sometimes it's quite difficult to do. sometimes there are path dependencies and a lot of setup costs and things you can't undo with certain operations. To just turn off the tap on them very quickly is not always very straightforward. What else have we got over here? Maybe something financial. Number 14, we're looking at CBIL, so that's the Corona Business Interruption Loan Scheme. Again, this is to do with government funding, and you have equivalents of this in many countries, which is essentially looking for the government to come in and take on some of your debt obligations. You may have a debt obligation to the bank, for example. You're struggling to pay that. The government will come in under this scheme and take on those payments, and then you'll have to pick them up later on. These are things that good accountants and organisations should be looking at trying to do. Number 5, here we've got rent deferral, which is basically just trying to negotiate with your landlords to delay any rent or lease payments that you have to pay in the current period. Again, there's a lot of legislation there, certainly in the UK context, supporting some of those activities. And you see this, the whole list there. You can read down. Stop capital expenditure. So a lot of big capital expenditure projects have stopped for many organisations. Again, those are not necessarily easy to put the brakes on if they're halfway through, and you need to have force majeure stipulations in contracts to allow you to do that. But where possible, many organisations are deferring capital expenditure projects because that saves them huge amounts of money. Just chasing up, increased debt collection, just basically chasing up anybody who owes you money and trying to make sure that they pay, which is a challenge given that everyone else is on the other side of that equation trying to defer any payments they need to make to creditors. So, a whole interesting bunch of things there, which, this has been recorded, you can look at in your own time, and we can provide you with the slides in any case. Final 2 slides there are just basically reinforcing some of the points that were made in that slide, some to do with financial stress testing, which is something that your organisations can do, particularly your finance department, and then other issues to do with liquidity and financing as well. I'm conscious that I've taken up more time than I planned to do, and I want to leave some more time for Renuka, who in any case is much more interesting than I am. So I'll leave it there for now. And I think the plan is Renuka will talk now, and then we will take questions and deal with comments at the end, okay, collectively. So if I can just jump onto something else there, stop sharing, and then I think over to you, either Renuka or Sarah, if you're going to introduce Renuka. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crawford. That's fantastic. We'll just pass over to Renuka and Renuka's slides now. Thank you.
Well, thanks again for joining. It's just really great to have the opportunity to speak to you all and share some of the research and actually the felt experience that we're having, not only at King's College London, but across people that we speak to in the private sector and the public sector. So Crawford's presentation and insights that are quite live at the moment is around the financial resilience piece. What I'll be speaking to shortly is just around the opportunity for COVID to be a catalyst for transformation. And the word catalyst has come up quite a bit. So not only in King's College London, where we're based, but also kind of previous work that I used to do around cross-government transformation for government. We previously used to say Brexit was a catalyst, now and an accelerator. And actually, when we think about COVID-19, we're seeing a new level of coordination, collaboration, and purpose that is driving transformation that previously could not happen. So actually, this kind of next 10-15 minutes is really going to be a series of reflections, and really interested to hear your views kind of in the open chat. And some reflections on how can we take this catalyst mentality or this momentum and bring it into the continuous transformation cycle. So I guess the first slide I'll share. This is, let me just get my tech right, and sorry for the jazzy transition, is something which sounds quite dramatic around the Valley of Death when we talk about transformation and transformation programs. And this is actually coined from the chairman of Crossrail, so Tony Meggs. When he talks about programs, transformational, kind of typical programs, infrastructure, etc., he talks about the Valley of Death. He says we go through this period of we have an idea, So, you know, it'd be really great to do this as a UK government. It'd be really great to do this as an organization. And then we need to move that idea, which is typically in the shape of a policy or a strategy, into implementation. So we need to get to done. And often that's us setting up, you know, projects and programs and infrastructure around that sits along our operational teams. Now, what we found from the research is that actually many of the programs that we set up to do that's change and transformational, they don't cross that valley of death. So actually we have a high rate of failure when we think of benefits, meeting benefits, costs, and timescales to the original business case. Sometimes that's because the original business case is often too ambitious to begin with. So from previous government days, we used to say something like universal credit could take, initially they thought a 3-year program, when actually when you think about the ambition of overhauling the welfare state, it's much longer than 3 years or 5 years, etc. So there is something about how you set up the transformation for success, and then how do you measure against that. But when we think about some of the reasons, and this is kind of reflecting pre-COVID-19, on why transformation and transformation programs often fail, it's specifically around the people space. So one is that when we know delivering a transformation program, which is different from, say, a change program, because you're not going into a state of business as usual, you're actually redefining what business as usual will look like completely, and often that's an unknown, which is a common thread when we think about COVID-19. But to do that, you need a strong sense of leadership purpose and a strong sense of vision across leadership. So some research that was conducted by Harvard earlier found that actually, though you need that as a precondition for transformation, fewer than 20% of leaders actually have a strong sense of their own purpose. So that, again, is a key blocker when we think about this valley of death. The next is around that divide between a program team and an operational team. So often we set up these artificial structures to say, these are the program team, they have the expertise, they know how to do it, they'll deliver this transformation. And that transformation will then be delivered into your operations. And what we found through some research that was done with case studies across governments was that actually there's this optimism bias between your program leadership and your operational team. So your operational team will actually, when you think about your transformation, there's a 30% discounting impact compared to your program management. And that's really important when we think about landing transformation, because at the end of the day, it does need to exist in operations. The last kind of insight I'll share with you around why transformation and transformation programs maybe do not meet their scheduled kind of benefits, costs, and timescales is around some recommendations at kind of IPA, where I used to be based in the Cabinet Office. Talks about kind of the recommendations that they see across multiple programs, transformational and otherwise. And they found that the majority of the recommendations that they're making to program teams and senior responsible owners are really around stakeholder management. So again, the people piece, governance, and then also project delivery capability. So again, the people piece around skills, etc. So I think there's a bit of research out there that does actually say, when we think about going from idea, policy, etc., into delivery and done, there's quite a few things that prevent that, and the majority being around actually, are we engaging our people effectively enough? And actually, when we look at the programs that do succeed, to time, to cost, etc., are the ones that are engaging their workforce. So some studies by McKinsey found that actually 83% of successful transformation surveyed focused on long-term staff capabilities. So not just the horizon of the 3 years or the 5 years for the transformation program. Furthermore, when we look at some of the success factors and success rate, you have a higher success rate when you actually have ownership by the front line, and then that drives change. So I guess that's things like change agents, making sure people have engagement into the program you're trying to deliver. So if we kind of move on to, that's kind of the setup of transformation, there's this ask to go from one end to the valley to another. What's different about COVID? So across not only kind of in King's internally, but when we think about kind of the broader sector, private and public, the common theme that's come out quite a bit and has been quoted back is, we could not have done this before without COVID. So essentially, we have very compressed timescales, but we've achieved a massive amount within those timescales. So you actually have things that typically would take about 3 years that are happening in 3 months. And in the manufacturing sector, we do see that actually things that would take 5 years are taking 18 months when we think about negotiating supply chain relationships and looking at your operations. So I'll just quickly give you some examples which you're aware of. Is one of the extensive digital collaboration. The fact that we can do this this webinar with people around the world right now and do it in a smart and slick way, that's quite new. That's in the past 3 months. So actually, when you look at the uptake of Microsoft Teams from February this year to now, you have a growth rate of 894% in just Teams. And traditionally, these are transformation programs that would take ages to deliver when you think about getting people onto a digital platform. The next is around workforce planning, and Crawford kind of mentioned this as well, the use in the UK of the furlough scheme. So essentially in the UK, there's 9.2 million employees that are currently on furlough, and that's approximately 1 in 4 employees. So what the implication is for particular sectors and organizations, you're operating at 25% less staff. So as a result, and we're doing this internally in King's, you have to look at what are the activities that you could pause, that you need to protect and actually deploy now itself because that's the need, or that you could stop. So it's actually forcing some early doors workforce planning conversations that previously would not happen at this pace. And it's actually putting quite a bit more pressure on our HR functions to work more hand in hand with areas like organization design and also to work cross-functionally. The kind of last example in terms of the catalyst and what we've seen with COVID-19 is around this whole mission approach. And this is actually something that was stated when we were speaking to people at post kind of the UK presence abroad. So we're looking at kind of FCO, DFID and other areas. It's actually what's really wonderful about responding to COVID-19, even though it's an emergency situation and there's lots of uncertainty, is this feeling that we're all pulling in the same direction, and all the departments, regardless of where we're coming from, have a common purpose. And we see this theme of purpose also reflected in the US in the medical profession. So actually there was a survey done by the American health professions, and they were looking at actually 57% felt that this crisis has actually helped them in terms of their sense of meaning and purpose of why they wanted to join the medical profession. So this is something that we even see in King's, that people are rallying around of actually we're here to serve our students, we're here to serve great research. So there's something about COVID-19 that's giving people something to rally around. So I guess, again, if we think about some of the results that COVID-19 has done in terms of transformation, so both on digital, workforce and purpose, there's some bridging factors, I'll kind of call them again to the analogy of the Valley of Death, that help us get there. So if we think about the crisis mode of COVID-19 support and what we might want to take forward, there's something about ownership by outcome. And some of this has come out through how we do our kind of approach to risk management. So you usually have kind of issue-based ownership. But actually what we've seen is actually this move to owning an outcome. So you have an outcome of making sure you have a good student experience, or you have an outcome in terms of looking at financial sustainability. And around that ownership is actually a clear side of ownership as well. So in public sectors, it can be quite tricky in terms of hierarchy, in terms of traditions, and it might be similar in other organizations as well that have quite kind of a legacy. But what this has really driven is a sense of a single point of contact in terms of responsibility, decision making, and then also a level of transparency in decision making as well. And partly this is due to the advent of Teams, where you could have multiple people joining the conversation, and you can also share in an easy way as well. So I think that's quite important when we think about outcomes as opposed to kind of siloed activity. The next is around constant communication and engagement. So previously, when we looked at communication in the transformation space, we had the research to say actually newsletters is not communication, that's not sufficient. It needs to be coupled with this two-way engagement when we think about our staff, because they need to get a sense about how they're feeling in terms of the transformation, what's working, what's not working. It's almost this permanent kind of pilot approach to what you're delivering. And actually we see that kind of at the forefront with COVID-19, because the level of uncertainty, because we don't have to kind of wait for all the answers, because we don't have all the answers, both as an organization or kind of wider when we think about the UK or worldwide, is that actually you have this regular rhythm of communication that we're trying to establish with our staff, and varying degrees of success, I have to admit, but at the same time that ambition to do that is definitely there. So I think this is something we need to keep up, because we see that coupling communication with engagement is extremely important in terms of success for transformation. The next, which is one I'm actually quite passionate about, is around this operational mix of a team rather than a pure program approach. So what we found in government, and we can also see it across our organizations, is that often we think about, we have an HR professional, we have a finance professional, we have a program professional, and we have some kind of strategic management, and they have X set of skills, but never the twine shall meet. So what we see is, again, with that outcome-based approach and almost problem-solving approach, is actually bringing the best out of different operational teams to solve a problem. And actually, some of the commentary and across discussing with different organizations is around, actually, you see issues around what grade are people, what team they're from, actually melt away, because again, people are focused on one common purpose and one common goal. And the next one, which is actually forefront in my mind, is around empathy and connection. So what we see with COVID-19 is actually the realization that people are people. So you have the professional world, but then you also have your personal world. And so this image, I don't know if you've seen the video on BBC. If you haven't, you should definitely look at it, where you have this kind of serious interview that the father is trying to do, and then his lovely daughter comes into the room. And I guess about a year or so ago, this would seem really foreign to us. And it had to be explained, but now actually it's a very different world, where we just recognize that people are people, and the fact that actually we have a certain level of empathy and understanding, and that divide between our kind of professional boundary and our personal boundaries changing. So it's creating a greater level of connection. And there's actually some research that's been done by the former Surgeon General of the US around the importance of actually this connection when we think about not only better health outcomes, but we think about kind of loneliness. So what we're actually realizing, and we could see this across the relationship that line managers have with their staff, is that there's actually more loneliness than we'd expected, and often we don't realize that that's the case. So it's the fact that we're having more connection and empathy is also then changing the nature of relationships in terms of management. So just in terms of time, because we need to create space for some questions, because we really want to hear from you. There's two themes when we kind of go, or a few themes when we go from recovery into readiness. So we're kind of in recovery mode, we're coming out of it when we think about, at least in the UK, the lifting of restrictions, both in mobility kind of across, and then also in our organizations, and again, returning to campus, for example. There's something about keeping the momentum into the new normal and keeping this shared situational awareness. So people, again, kind of rallying around a common goal. So one is, again, that focus on outcomes. And this is something in terms of the outcome focus that's quite prominent in the international development sector, where they use something called a theories of change and a log frame, because they're dealing with the different populations. But they say, what's the outcome I'm trying to achieve? And then from there, making sure you sequence what needs to be achieved outcome-wise based on your business cycle. So for King's, for example, we need to think about what's the pre-start, and then actually what's the start look like, and what are the key outcomes we need in terms of a positive experience. And then also we need to think about capacities. So then to deliver those outcomes, what are the capacities that you need to have as an organization to operate? So for example, investing more into digital platforms, that's a core capacity you need to deliver X, Y, Z. The next is around capability. And this goes back to this idea of kind of professions and mixed teams. What are the capabilities that you need across your workforce? And this is really important, because not only does it allow you to service what needs to be done, so kind of the key outcomes, etc., but then it also helps to kind of create those career pathways too. So you do have a base level of capability, so kind of customer service, negotiation, etc. And then from there, are there certain capabilities you can build on? So it creates more movement when we think about people's career progression, especially particularly for junior staff. The next one, which is something that we experience it quite a bit, is that shift from a line manager to be the kind of command and control to a coach relationship with your manager. So it's that sense of being there for your staff and for your employees, and kind of that, again, people as people, even though if you don't have all the answers. So it's that connection, and that's something that we see across the board at different organizations. So I guess I just want to, before closing, just kind of say that, you know, there's a lot of frameworks out there, and different organizations maybe are using kind of scenario planning, they're doing stress testing, a certain way to risk management. So one thing is to just kind of keep focus on what you're trying to achieve in the transformation space. Use what you can from the frameworks that you have. So we kind of call it that scavenger approach, to quote one of our academics. Use what you can to achieve what you need to achieve, because the one thing that we really see is, again, that melting away of some of the professional divides into people delivering a common goal. So if I had to leave you with some reflections in terms of COVID-19. So COVID-19 is really, it's an event, it's a global pandemic event. We see similar kind of parallels when we think about the financial crisis, when we think about the Great Depression, when you think about major events in our history that have created, though extremely challenging, have created a license to do. So actually there's a bit of a reset button and a moment that we have, and again, it's kind of reflecting on government days where we say Brexit is an accelerator, to kind of revisit policy and revisit your day-to-day kind of professional and personal routines and practices. When you're doing that, focus on people first. So it's about people, it's not about frameworks. So you can do the most beautiful framework in the world when it comes to delivering a transformation, and you know, we've seen those time and time again. It can look great on paper, and that's even for the strategy space. It can be really great PDF that's, you know, 120 pages, etc. But actually, if people don't buy into it, it's not going to land and it's not going to happen. So when you're moving from recovery into readiness, make sure you keep your people at the center and leverage your people in kind of comms in HR, but in kind of broader areas across the organization to do that. And the last one is Carpe Diem, which you know, seize the day. So essentially we're moving to a pace of new normal, but actually the new normal is about change and it's about continuous transformation. It's not going to be slowing down at this stage. So what are the things that you need to achieve in terms of core outcomes that you can actually embed into your cycle and achieve when we think about the next stage of transformation? So I guess on that note, I will stop sharing my screen and pass over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Renuka. So bear with me 2 seconds. I just need to load some additional slides. One thing I will say that I didn't say at the start, so everyone should have received email contact details for us through the Eventbrite email. Obviously we're taking questions here, but if anybody has any questions they want to put to any of us, one-to-one, through email or through phone, just please do get in contact with me either through the Q&A function today, but obviously via email. I'll also be sharing email and telephone contact details at the end of slide presentation details as well. So what we sort of touched on a little bit at the start is that King's Business School has been a part of King's College London, launched from King's College London since 1989, and really in addition to the programmes that we're probably predominantly known for, are amazing, excellently ranked undergraduate and postgraduate degree programmes. Over the last couple of years, we've really developed some excellent short courses, both directly for organisations. So if you have an organisational need, we can come and design a tailored programme just for you. But also in the sort of thing that we've been talking about today, open education programs, executive education programs, where we will bring people together from specific individual organisations and sort of really get you to share that experience. And the difference, some of the differences really from committing to a full kind of 2-year master's programme or something like that, it tends to be both in terms of the time commitment, but also potentially in terms of the focus. So you should be able to see on the slide in front of you the programs that we're offering this year, and we're able to really do a very kind of specific look at some areas that we'd sort of see as a kind of leadership and management toolkit. And these are programs that we've developed for experienced mid-career professionals. So people looking at taking that next step up into general management or leadership, and maybe needing to grow their expertise from a very specific functional understanding to more of a kind of a leadership viewpoint. And that's specifically what executive education aims to do, with a real focus on practical impact and applying the theory. So we will talk a lot about research, but we'll also talk about what does that mean directly for your role in your organisation or your future in a leadership role. And we've very much asked you to come to the room willing to share in a very confidential environment, and whether that's a virtual room or an in-person room at King's College in London, asking you to share your experiences and learn not only from the faculty and the guest speakers, but also from the other people in the room with you. And the huge benefit of that is being surrounded by people from very different industries. So I don't, again, as we've been saying, I know we're quite short on time now, so I want to make sure there's time for questions. Some of the things that people talk about in terms of the benefits for these type of programs, what I've touched on is things like strengthening your leadership behaviours. So these are often about kind of practicing things like people management, some of the soft skills, getting a lot of our programs will have simulation exercises in, so getting comfortable with trying out the ideas. We also look at sort of quite technical things, so we will look at in some of our programs for things like compliance and governance, so there are definitely new knowledge and ideas to be gained. We talk a lot about sort of greater confidence and things like informing your decision making, so making you a better all-rounded leader, well-rounded leader. I've touched on the idea of working with the participant group, and those tend to be networks that will stay with you. So if you've not done an executive education program before, that's often one of the things that people will talk to me about afterwards, are keeping those contacts and having somebody that you can phone up outside of your organisation to talk over a problem or a challenge with, somebody who is impartial, who will not be affected by your decision making and things like that. And that's a very kind of key benefit. Let me go on to that. So there was a list of programs there, the 4 programs that we're offering this year. The first program that will come up is Strategic Marketing Management in early September. It very much looks at marketing both as a technical but as a kind of a leadership toolkit. So we look at the commercial aspects of getting to know your market well, getting to know consumer behaviour, and how you can use that in both planning and developing marketing campaigns and developing products. It's very much built on the research of what's happening now. So we have a lot of excellent sessions in there around marketing features and use of digital marketing strategies. Some fantastic sessions on that, and include a simulation exercise, which is one of the real things that tests the kind of applied learning, with things being thrown at you as you make a decision, and that really kind of reflects how people behave in the real world, I'd say, in terms of particularly as we've just touched on today, in terms of not knowing all the information as you make a decision, and how that can affect as you launch a product, market a product, and assess how it's done. So strategic management and governance is a program that we're actually going to run virtually this year. So I should say first as well that we're taking applications for all these programs now. It's an application process. It's not a lengthy application process as you would apply to a degree program, but we just like to have a kind of soft check on things so that we know the people in the room with you will be able to have those really pertinent conversations. So a short application process where we ask for your CV and a short supporting statement online. Strategic management and governance is the program that we are running virtually at the end of September. And this is a new program for us this year, really blending the technical aspects of governance and compliance with a real leadership stance on that. So the kind of thing that anyone would need as they're moving from a middle management position to an aspiring board position or aspiring leadership position, to have a really good understanding of the issues that can be found in there, the problems and the challenges, as well as the ways to kind of harness that as a success as you are having discussions and making plans. So leadership and people management is one of our flagship programs and has been running for several years. And this really gets into the nitty-gritty of one of our key resources as we all work, and that is obviously people. So how do you really get the best out of your people, and how do you deal with problems? Because in every organisation there are issues. So very much we talk about the idea of an organisation as a political entity and themes of power and confrontation and politics. We look at emotional intelligence in leadership. So not at the idea of a leader being one set role or one set has to act in one particular way, but just in terms of using emotional intelligence to make your own leadership style the most effective it can be. And again, in this programme, one of the really valuable aspects of that is blended in with the days of theory and discussion and debate and bringing in your own experience is a simulation exercise, which really allows you to kind of play through some of these ideas to try out slightly different ways of acting and have real-time feedback from some of the coaches and faculty in the room about that. So that's a programme that runs in person and will run over 4 days in November. And then finally, so I'm very conscious of time now, finally, Finance for Strategic Impact, of which Professor Crawford Spence is the programme director, so I'm sure we'll be very pleased to talk about it a little more in depth today if anybody has any specific questions. Very much looking at finance as a leadership tool. So not necessarily, you're not going to walk out of this with an accountancy qualification, but you will be able to have much easier, much more confident discussions with external and internal finance professionals. You will be able to stand up and present your full proposal, including the costs and the drivers of profitability and things like that. You will be able to assess the budget sheets and so forth that are put in front of you, and really be able to question things, really easily ask intelligent questions. It's about how you communicate with finance, how you work confidently with finance as a leader. Just now go on to questions. So I'm really pleased to see that we've got some questions coming through, and we will run through those. If we don't get through all of your questions today, if anybody needs to leave, I'm very conscious that we're nearly through the hour. Again, we will keep going for as long as we can and cover those questions. And then if we don't cover them verbally, then I will source some written responses and circulate that with the full presentation. What I will do, and I hope everybody can see the contact details there in terms of email, but I'll also circulate that by email so everyone's got an email address for us. We have a question here for Crawford, somebody who wants to ask about the government-backed loan schemes for businesses. So this person has asked, what are the factors, reasons for government to write off these loans, and is that something that's very likely to happen? I'll hand over to you, Crawford.
Yeah, sure. I probably wasn't very clear about that in the presentation and said something rather glib. Although it can be backed up, I think. Of course, the government is not giving this money expecting it to be all written off. However, many organisations have received government loans, and these are not organisations that will necessarily survive the current crisis. Therefore, there will be some element of bad debt written off by the government, and I'm sure government accountants are sitting there with a certain assumption in their head, whether that's 5%, 10%, 20%. I don't know. As far as I'm aware, those assumptions are not publicly available. But it's inconceivable that all the money that the government has loaned out will be paid back to the exchequer. So just as the bailouts in 2008, 2009. were put together rather hastily. If I recall, the Fed in the US put together a bailout package for major institutional banks to the value of $700 billion on one piece of paper. They hadn't really thought through the whole consequences or how they would claw back all of that money, and not all of it did come back. Then similar thing is going to happen to the government here. That's not to suggest that they shouldn't be funding organisations, because they're maintaining jobs and maintaining social cohesion as well. So one could argue that it's okay to write off some of that money. There's a social benefit for doing so, but certainly not all of it is going to come back to the government, although the government obviously wants it to come back. Yeah, but companies that go to the wall, those loans will just have to be written off.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I have a question now. I think maybe I'll put to Renuka, if that's okay. As a result of the catalyst, as a result of everything happening this year, what kind of other impacts are we starting to see in remote working in businesses? Do we have a sense of, and I know we sort of touched on this in your presentation, Renuka, do we have a sense of whether the new normal will include more remote working, or remote working as the default, I guess?
Thank you for the question, Anonymous. I guess there's a bit of, it'll depend on the organization. There's a trend towards an acceptance that remote working actually doesn't have a dip in productivity. So there was initial assumption that, oh, people are working remotely will have a dip in productivity for either because they don't have the equipment that they need to do their job, or because when people are remote working, if we're really cynical, are they really working? So I think the myths around that have really changed, and the fact that the technology has been able to deliver the capability to have meetings like this, or to kind of do presentations to deliver what we need to do, that has created a new space for remote working. And there's so I guess there's now an acceptance that remote working, you can do your work. There's a new normal there. It'll be up to the organization to determine what extent that will go. So is that something that previously organizations might say an employee will work remotely for kind of 1 day a week and then the rest be permanently in, so it's kind of fixed, or will it become a bit more flexible? There's also going to be, I would say, a question on, with the advent of digital, are we using our meetings still in the right way? So I think with remote working now, I don't know about you all, but sometimes we have now, we liberalized meetings, but to the extent where we're back to back to back, because we no longer need to physically go down the hall or to a new building. So there will be a need with remote working, I think working in general, to rethink the structures of our meetings, the purpose of our meetings, to maybe scale back and re-rationalize around it. But happy to kind of follow up after if you'd like to.
Thank you so much. So I have one quick question, then I'm going to pass back to you, Renuka, if that's okay. So a practical question, something that I didn't highlight: how much do the courses cost for executive education? So our executive education courses tend to be 3.5 days, 4 days long. That's something that I didn't really highlight either. So there's a real kind of convenience that we've purposely designed into there in terms of time away from work, and the cost for them, for the marketing, the finance and the leadership program, each are £2,500 per program, and for governance this year it's 2,250, simply because we're offering that virtually. So there's a little bit of a less of a resource cost for us. And one thing that we offer as well at the moment is that once you've done one of the courses, you become an executive education alumni. So then you get a preferential rate after that with a 10% discount off the other courses. So that's that one. And then I was going to pass it back to Renuka with a question about scaling up SMEs. I'm not sure if this is one you want to answer offline, Renuka, or this one is one for now in terms of how much detail we can go into in the time. But somebody asking, in terms of scaling up SMEs, is this a sector which is a sort of a motor of GDP growth and will survive crisis this year, such as COVID and then Brexit in the UK? Is that one for now, or is that maybe one to come back on email about?
Yeah, I think it'd be good to have a proper conversation, if you don't mind, David, because there's quite a bit of initiatives underway, and it'd just be great to have a chat. So shall we perhaps take that one offline, if that's all right? And maybe Crawford, if you'd like to join.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I can link the two of you up if that's okay, and we can sort of take it offline. I'm just really conscious of the time now, so that's great. In terms of really just drawing everything to a close, because we're a little bit over the hour, I don't know if I hand back to you, Renuka, and then to you, Crawford. So Renuka first, if there are any sort of summary statements you want to make in terms of takeaways for people. I know really that you both did this in your presentation, but takeaways for people to think about over the next few weeks and so forth, and potentially, Crawford, from your course particularly, any key takeaways that you find that participants have in terms of practical takeaways. So Renuka, over to you first.
I guess in terms of key takeaways, and thank you for the questions and for everyone for staying with us for the hour, is that we're all in it together. So it's one of those rare moments in history where we're all experiencing the pandemic, both personally and professionally, where again that need for connection and support is even more important, and understanding. So both if we think about our jobs, line management sense, and understanding that actually people might be a bit too busy or too caught up to maybe provide X, Y, Z that we might need. So I think it's a shift moment for us. So do keep in touch, and actually take the opportunity with seminars and webinars like this to connect to others and to kind of learn new things, because we're all constantly learning, because nothing has happened like this before.
And then over to you, Crawford. Thank you, Renuka.
Yeah, okay, so just very briefly, in terms of what we're trying to offer in the Finance for Strategic Impact course, as Sarah helpfully pointed out, we're not trying to turn people into chartered accountants or financial analysts. All we're trying to do is something really quite modest, which is to boost people's financial literacy. So by the end of 2.5, 3 days with us, you're not going to be going away and calculating your own cash burn ratios or gearing ratios or liquidity ratios. You may do a little bit of that in class, but really the objective of this is to be able to go away and ask someone who's given you a financial presentation pertinent questions, so that you sound like you know what you're talking about, and indeed you do know what you're talking about. So you can ask them pertinent questions about cash burn. You can ask them pertinent pressing questions about leverage or gearing, and you can ask them pertinent and challenging questions about liquidity or profitability or any other area of that's important for the financial management of an organisation. So at the end of it, you'll come away, finance will be slightly demystified for you. It won't be as scary as it was before, and you'll be able to hold relevant conversations with people who are experts in that area. So I think that's what we're really trying to achieve. And in my experience of doing this at King's and other institutions, I think we're fairly successful at doing that.
Thank you so much, Crawford. Thank you everybody for attending today, for staying through to the questions, for the brilliant questions. I've noticed, just as we've gone through those last remarks, there's a couple more questions, and if you don't mind, I'll come back to you offline about those and ask either Renuka or Crawford, or both perhaps, to come back as well on those. And really, just to say that I will be circulating the recording and lots more information, and we're really keen to have much more conversations with people, really, whether that's a telephone call, a Skype call. And when I say thank you for sticking through the full hour, I'm sort of aware there's been a few technical hitches and so forth, which is really what we've been talking about today. So we're all sort of very much doing this from home and sort of trying to swap between cameras and all this kind of stuff. And I'm sure in a couple of months' time, this will very much be the new normal, and I will be much more slick at doing this. So thank you so much, everybody, and I hope to see you at an event again soon. Thank you very much. Bye.